Hey guys, tonight we travel into the smoky, sticky, and surprisingly dangerous world of medieval taverns, those legendary gathering places where ale flowed like rivers. Strangers became friends or enemies, and the line between civilization and chaos was as thin as watered-down beer. But forget everything you think you know from fantasy movies and video games. The real medieval tavern was a place where survival meant more than just avoiding the food poisoning. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're walking through the muddy streets of 14th century London, your boots squishing through a mixture of horse poop, rotting vegetables, and things you'd rather not identify. The rain has been falling for 3 days straight, turning every road into a river of dirt. Your stomach growls with a hunger that hurts your very soul, and your throat burns with a thirst that water alone cannot satisfy. In the distance, through the gray fog and smoke, you see it, a wooden sign creaking in the wind, painted with the rough image of a boar's head or a bunch of grapes. The warm glow of firelight spills from small windows, and the sound of laughter, shouting, and something that might generously be called singing, drifts through the heavy wooden door. You found a tavern, and whether you know it or not, you're about to enter a world that works by its own rules, where fortunes are won and lost on the roll of dice, where a wrong word can earn you a knife between the ribs, and where the ale might be the cleanest thing you drink all day. The medieval tavern wasn't just a place to drink, it was the beating heart of community life. The unofficial town hall, the stock exchange, the employment office, and the entertainment center, all rolled into one smoky, chaotic, gloriously alive place. But it was also a place where danger lurked in every shadow, where disease spread faster than gossip, and where the careless could lose everything they owned before the night was through. Tonight, we're going to pull back the romantic veil that centuries of storytelling have draped over these places. We're going to explore the real taverns of medieval Europe. Not the cleaned-up versions of Hollywood, but the genuine article in all its grimy, violent, fascinating glory. We'll discover what you'd really eat and drink, who you'd meet, what games you'd play, and most importantly, how you might survive the experience. Because make no mistake, visiting a medieval tavern was an adventure in the truest sense of the word, and like all real adventures, it came with genuine risks. The first thing that would hit you upon entering a medieval tavern wasn't the sight or the sound. It was the smell. A complex mixture of smells that would attack your nose with the force of a mailed fist. Imagine, if you will, the concentrated essence of unwashed people mixed with the sour tang of spilled ale, the harsh smoke of poorly aired fires, and the mysterious but unmistakable odor of things that had been left to rot in dark corners for far too long. The floors, if they could be called that, were typically nothing more than packed dirt covered with a layer of rushes, long grasses that were supposed to soak up spills and provide some appearance of cleanliness. In theory, these rushes were changed regularly. In practice, they often remained in place for months, slowly breaking down into a rich collection of rotting organic matter, spilled food, and the occasional small dead body of whatever rodent had been unlucky enough to meet its end in the tavern's depths. Walking across these floors was like crossing a spongy, unpredictable landscape. Your feet might sink into soft spots where ale had soaked through to the earth below, or crunch on the bones of long-forgotten meals. The more fancy places might have actual wooden floors, but even these were stained dark with years of spills and marked with the scars of countless knife fights, dice games gone wrong, and the general wear and tear of serving as the stage for humanity's lower instincts. The walls, built of wattle and daub, a mixture of wooden strips woven together and covered with mud, straw, and animal dung, were blackened with smoke and grease. They sweated moisture in the winter and gave off heat in the summer, creating a climate that was always uncomfortable. Crude paintings or carvings might decorate these walls, often showing religious scenes, royal symbols, or more earthly pleasures, depending on the establishment's customers and the owner's sense of right and wrong. But it was the ceiling that truly completed the atmospheric experience. Low, heavy, and blackened with decades of smoke, it seemed to press down on the people like a physical weight. Massive wooden beams, often saved from ships or torn from ancient forests, supported the structure above. From these beams hung all manner of objects. Dried herbs that did little to hide the main odors, strings of onions and garlic, sides of bacon or ham in various stages of preservation, and sometimes the less pleasant remains of customers who had failed to pay their debts or had otherwise offended the establishment's sense of justice. The lighting came primarily from the great fireplace that took up one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows that made every face look evil, and every corner seemed to hide potential threats. Candles, when they could be afforded, provided additional light, but their flickering glow only added to the sense of unease that filled these places. The smoke from both fire and candles had nowhere to go but up, where it collected under the low ceiling before eventually finding its way out through gaps in the thatch. or crude smoke holes that did little to improve the air quality. In this environment, every breath was an adventure. The air was thick enough to chew, loaded with particles of soot, grease, and the breath of dozens of people who considered bathing a seasonal activity at best. Newcomers often found themselves coughing and wheezing, their eyes streaming tears that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with the simple act of trying to breathe. Yet, for all its assault on the senses, there was something undeniably alive about a medieval tavern. The very air seemed to pulse with energy, with the raw life force of people living life at its most basic level. This was humanity stripped of pretense, reduced to its basic elements: the need for food, drink, friendship, and the occasional release of violence. It was uncomfortable, it was dangerous, but it was never ever boring, and as your eyes adjusted to the dim light and your lungs adapted to the thick air, you began to make out the figures that filled this smoky underworld. Merchants counting coins with suspicious eyes, soldiers still wearing the mud of distant battlefields, pilgrims seeking shelter on their way to holy sites, craftsmen celebrating the completion of a difficult job, and locals who seemed to have grown from the very floorboards themselves. So perfectly did they blend with their each face told a story, and most of those stories were written in scars, missing teeth, and eyes that had seen too much. These were not the cleaned-up peasants of romantic literature, but real people living real lives in an age when survival was never guaranteed, and comfort was a luxury few could afford. They wore their hardships like badges of honor, and their laughter, when it came, had the sharp edge of those who knew that tomorrow might bring nothing but sorrow. The tavern keeper, usually a man of substantial size and questionable morals, ruled over this chaos like a king over his court. His word was law within these walls, and his justice was swift and often brutal. He knew every customer's name, their debts, their secrets, and their weaknesses. He was part confessor, part loan shark, and part executioner, depending on what the situation required. His wife, if he had one, was often equally tough, wielding a wooden spoon or rolling pin with the skill of a trained warrior and the authority of a judge. This was the world you entered when you pushed through that heavy wooden door. A world where the normal rules of society were paused, where anything could happen, and where the only certainty was uncertainty itself. It was a place that could offer you the best night of your life, or the last night of your life, sometimes both at the same time. And as you stood there taking in this assault on your senses, you realized that you had crossed more than just a doorway. You had entered a different realm entirely, one governed by its own laws, its own customs, and its own particular brand of justice. Whether you would emerge unharmed depended entirely on your wits, your luck, and your ability to navigate the dangerous social currents that flowed through every medieval tavern like an underground river. Not all medieval drinking places were created equal, and understanding the small but important differences between an inn, a tavern, and an alehouse could mean the difference between a comfortable night's rest and waking up in a ditch with your purse missing and your head ringing like a church bell. At the top of this hierarchy stood the inns, the nobles of the hospitality world. These places were primarily designed to house travelers, offering not just food and drink, but actual beds, or at least something that resembled beds more than it resembled a pile of straw. The better inns were substantial buildings, often built of stone rather than the more common wood, endowed with multiple stories and rooms that could accommodate merchants, pilgrims, and other travelers who had both the money and the need for overnight lodging. The Tabard in Insadark, made famous by Geoffrey Chaucer in his Canterbury Tales, was one such place. Here, according to Chaucer's account, travelers could expect to find food of the best kind, and wine that was both strong and pleasing. The host was described as a man of substance, someone who took pride in his place, and his ability to provide for his guests' needs. This was hospitality as a profession, not merely as a way of getting rid of extra ale. But even the finest inns had their oddities that would shock modern sensibilities. Privacy, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. Travelers were routinely packed into rooms like cargo with 10 or 12 strangers sharing not just the same space, but often the same bed. The concept of individual rooms was reserved for the very wealthy, and even then it was more about status than comfort. The beds themselves were marvels of medieval engineering and endurance. Made of rope or leather straps stretched across wooden frames, they supported mattresses stuffed with straw, feathers, or whatever organic material was available and affordable. These mattresses were rarely changed and never cleaned in any meaningful sense. They were home to entire families of fleas, lice, bedbugs, and other creatures that viewed human guests as nothing more than a convenient food source. Sharing a bed with strangers was not just uncomfortable, but potentially dangerous. Theft was common, as was violence born of disputes over space, snoring, or the various bodily functions that humans perform during sleep. Many travelers learned to sleep with one eye open, and their most valuable possessions clutched tightly to their chests. The food at inns was generally better than what you might find elsewhere, but this was a relative term. The best inns might offer roasted meats, fresh bread, and ale that had been brewed within the past few days. The worst might serve you something that had once been an animal. accompanied by bread that could double as a weapon, and ale that tasted suspiciously like it had been filtered through a horse. Taverns occupied the middle ground of medieval hospitality. Originally, these places were the domain of vintners, wine merchants who sold their wares directly to the public. Wine was expensive, imported from France, Spain, or the Rhine region, and carried with it an air of sophistication that ale could never match. A gallon of decent red wine from Gascony might cost 3 pennies, twice the price of the finest ale, while Rhenish wine could command 6 to 8 pennies per gallon. The wine trade was heavily regulated, and for good reason. Cheating was common, with dishonest tavern keepers watering down their wine, mixing it with cheaper alternatives, or even creating entirely fake versions, using whatever ingredients they could find. The punishments for such deception were severe and public. A tavern keeper caught selling fake wine might find himself locked in the pillory with the offending liquid poured over his head, a form of punishment that combined public shame with poetic justice. To fight fraud, customers had the right to inspect the wine they were purchasing. A suspicious patron could demand to be taken down to the cellar to see the actual barrel from which his wine was being drawn. This practice led to the development of elaborate cellars beneath many taverns, cool underground chambers where barrels of wine aged, and where the more careful customers could verify the realness of their purchase. Wine criers, officials whose job it was to inspect and announce the quality and price of wine available in local taverns, roamed the streets, calling out their findings. These men, often doubling as town criers, would proclaim the virtues of wine available at 4 farthings, or warn of places where the quality was suspect. Their announcements were both advertisement and consumer protection, helping customers make informed decisions about where to spend their hard-earned coins. As taverns evolved, they began to expand their offerings beyond wine. Cider made from apples, perry from pears, and mead from honey all found their way onto tavern tables. Some places began offering food as well, recognizing that hungry customers were thirsty customers, and that a man with food in his belly was more likely to stay and continue drinking. The transformation of taverns from wine shops to full-service places was gradual, but inevitable. As their profits from food and drink grew, many tavern keepers began offering rooms for rent, blurring the lines between taverns and inns. These rooms were typically small, cramped spaces on the upper floors of the building, often housing multiple strangers who had never met before and might never meet again. At the bottom of the hospitality hierarchy were the alehouses, humble places that began as private homes where the housewife brewed more ale than her family could consume. These women, known as alewives, would signal the availability of fresh ale by hanging a stick or broom outside their door, a simple but effective form of medieval advertising. Ale was the lifeblood of medieval society, consumed by everyone from infants to the elderly because it was often safer than water. The brewing process, which involved boiling water, killed many of the harmful bacteria that made untreated water dangerous to drink. A typical alewife might brew several times a week, producing ale that would last only a few days before turning sour or developing off flavors. The quality of ale varied enormously from house to house and batch to batch. Some alewives took pride in their craft, producing ale that was clear, flavorful, and properly fermented. Others were less careful, selling ale that was weak, sour, or contaminated with whatever ingredients they had used to stretch their grain supplies. Breadcrumbs, herbs, and even less pleasant additives might find their way into a batch of ale, either by accident or design. Despite their humble origins, alehouses were subject to strict regulation. The assize of bread and ale, enacted in 1266, tied the price of ale to the price of wheat and established quality standards that all brewers were expected to meet. Ale conners, sworn officials whose job it was to test ale and ensure its quality, made regular rounds of alehouses, sampling the wares and ensuring that customers were getting what they paid for. The punishments for brewing bad ale or charging too much were severe and public. Male brewers who violated the assize might find themselves locked in the pillory, while female brewers faced a tumbrel, not the massive siege engine, but a smaller device designed to dunk the offender repeatedly in the nearest body of water. These punishments served both as warning and entertainment, drawing crowds who enjoyed watching the downfall of those who had tried to cheat their neighbors. But alehouses offered more than just drink. They were social centers where news was shared, gossip was exchanged, and business was conducted. A successful alewife might find herself at the center of her community's social network, knowing secrets and scandals that could make or break reputations. She was part bartender, part therapist, and part information broker, roles that required discretion, wisdom, and a thick skin. The atmosphere in an alehouse was typically more relaxed than in a tavern or in. These were neighborhood places where everyone knew everyone else, where credit might be extended to trusted customers, and where disputes were more likely to be settled with words than weapons. But even alehouses had their dangers. and a stranger entering such an establishment might find himself the subject of intense scrutiny and suspicion. Understanding these distinctions was crucial for any medieval traveler. Choose the wrong place and you might find yourself paying in prices for alehouse quality, or worse, sleeping in a ditch because you couldn't afford the accommodations you had assumed would be available. The wise traveler learned to read the signs literally and figuratively that indicated what kind of place he was entering and what he could expect to find there. In a world where water could kill you faster than your enemies, alcohol wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity. The medieval relationship with drink was fundamentally different from our modern understanding, shaped by practical concerns that made sobriety not just unpleasant, but potentially fatal. Water, the most basic of human needs, was often the most dangerous thing you could put in your mouth. Rivers served as highways, sewers, and dumping grounds all at once. The Thames in London was a flowing cocktail of human waste, animal bodies, industrial runoff from tanneries and dye works, and the general trash of urban life. Wells, when they existed, were frequently contaminated by seepage from nearby cesspits or graveyards. Even rainwater collected in barrels and cisterns quickly became breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites. The solution was alcohol. The brewing and fermentation process, which required boiling water and produced ethanol, killed most of the harmful microorganisms that made water dangerous. This wasn't understood in scientific terms. The germ theory of disease was still centuries away. But the practical effects were obvious. People who drank ale, wine, or other fermented beverages were less likely to fall ill with the mysterious stomach ailments that plagued those who relied on water. This led to a society where alcohol consumption began at birth and continued until death. Infants were given weak ale or wine mixed with water. Children drank small beer, a low-alcohol beverage that provided calories and hydration without causing drunkenness. Adults consumed stronger versions throughout the day, not to get drunk, but to stay alive and healthy. The brewing of ale was primarily women's work, a domestic skill passed down from mother to daughter like cooking or weaving. An alewife's reputation rested on her ability to produce consistent, flavorful ale that would keep her family and customers healthy and satisfied. The process was both art and science, requiring knowledge of grain quality, water sources, fermentation, timing, and the dozens of variables that could turn a promising batch into undrinkable swill. The basic ingredients were simple: malted barley, water, and yeast. The barley was soaked until it began to sprout, then dried to stop the germination process. This malting converted the grain starches into fermentable sugars. The malted barley was then mashed with hot water to extract these sugars, creating a sweet liquid called wort. Wild yeasts in the air would begin fermentation naturally, converting the sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. But simplicity in ingredients didn't mean simplicity in execution. The quality of the barley affected everything. Grain that had been damaged by rain, frost, or pests would produce inferior ale. The water source was crucial. Some wells produced ale with off flavors, while others seemed to enhance the brewing process. The temperature during mashing and fermentation could make the difference between success and failure, and medieval brewers had no thermometers to guide them, relying instead on experience and intuition. Hops, which would later become essential to beer brewing, were not widely used in medieval England until the 15th century. Instead, brewers relied on a mixture of herbs and spices called grute to flavor and preserve their ale. Bog myrtle, yarrow, heather, and dozens of other plants might be added to give ale its distinctive taste and to help it keep longer. Some of these additives had mind-altering properties, adding an extra dimension to the drinking experience that modern beer lacks. The result was a beverage that bore little resemblance to modern beer. Medieval ale was cloudy, often thick enough to chew, and had a complex flavor profile that might include notes of herbs, spices, and whatever else the brewer had decided to add. It was typically consumed within a few days of brewing before it could turn sour or develop off flavors. The alcohol content varied widely from the weak. Small beer given to children, two stronger versions that could leave a grown man senseless. Wine occupied a different spot in medieval society. Where ale was the drink of the common people, wine carried ideas of sophistication, wealth, and religious significance. The Christian Church's use of wine in communion gave it a sacred quality that ale could never match, while its higher cost made it a status symbol for those who could afford it. England's wine came primarily from its continental possessions and trading partners. Gascon wine from southwestern France was the most common, a red wine that was relatively affordable and traveled well. Rhenish wine from the German regions along the Rhine was more expensive but prized for its quality. Spanish and Portuguese wines were exotic luxuries, while the sweet wines of Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean were reserved for the very wealthy. The wine trade was international commerce at its most complex. Merchants had to navigate not just the physical challenges of transportation, wine could spoil, freeze, or turn to vinegar during long journeys, but also the political and economic obstacles created by wars, tariffs, and trade disputes. A barrel of wine that left Bordeaux in perfect condition might arrive in London as expensive vinegar if the journey took too long or the weather was bad. Wine merchants, known as vintners, were among the wealthiest and most influential members of medieval society. They maintained extensive networks of contacts across Europe, financed trading expeditions, and often served as informal bankers and diplomats. The Vintners' Company in London was one of the most powerful guilds with the authority to regulate wine quality, set prices, and punish those who violated trade standards. But wine's prestige made it a target for fraud. Dishonest merchants might water down their wine, mix expensive varieties with cheaper ones, or create entirely counterfeit wines, using whatever ingredients they could find. Alum, honey, herbs, and even more dangerous substances might be added to copy the color, flavor, or effects of genuine wine. The penalties for such deception were severe, but the potential profits made the risks worthwhile for some. Mead made from fermented honey occupied a special place in medieval drinking culture. Often called the drink of the gods, mead was associated with celebration, ceremony, and the warrior culture of earlier ages. It was expensive to produce. Honey was a valuable commodity used for sweetening, medicine, and candle making, but its intoxicating effects and symbolic significance made it worth the cost for special occasions. The brewing of mead was more art than science, requiring careful attention to the ratio of honey to water, the temperature of fermentation, and the timing of various additions. Spices, fruits, and herbs might be added to create different flavors and effects. Some meads were aged for years, developing complex flavors that could rival the finest wines. Others were consumed young, their sweetness and strength making them popular at weddings, festivals, and other celebrations. Cider and perry, made from apples and pears respectively, were regional specialties that reflected local agriculture and preferences. In areas where apple orchards flourished, cider might be more common than ale. While perry was popular in regions where pear trees grew well, these beverages could range from mildly alcoholic to powerfully intoxicating depending on the fruit used and the fermentation process. The seasonal nature of fruit meant that cider and perry were often available only at certain times of year, making them special treats rather than daily staples. The best ciders were made from specific varieties of apples that had been bred for their fermentation qualities rather than their eating characteristics. These cider apples were often small, sour, and unpleasant when fresh, but they produced beverages of remarkable complexity and strength. All of these alcoholic beverages shared certain characteristics that distinguished them from their modern counterparts. They were living products, continuing to ferment and change even after they were served. They were unpredictable, with each batch potentially different from the last. They were often contaminated with bacteria, wild yeasts, and other microorganisms that could produce unexpected flavors and effects, and they were essential to life in a way that modern drinkers can barely understand. The tavern keeper's skill lay not just in acquiring these beverages, but in storing, serving, and pricing them appropriately. A good tavern keeper knew which barrels were at their peak, which were beginning to turn, and which should be sold quickly before they became undrinkable. He understood the preferences of his customers, the seasonal variations in supply and demand, and the delicate balance between profit and reputation that determined his success or failure. If the drink in medieval taverns was questionable, the food was often downright dangerous. Yet for many people, the tavern meal was the best they could hope for, a hot, filling dish that might contain actual meat and vegetables, served in portions generous enough to satisfy even the hardiest appetite. The centerpiece of tavern cuisine was potage, a thick stew that could contain virtually anything edible, and quite a few things that weren't. The concept was simple. Take a large cauldron, fill it with water or broth, add whatever ingredients were available, and let it simmer until everything was tender enough to eat. The result was a dish that was different every day, sometimes different every hour, as new ingredients were added to replace what had been served. The perpetual stew or hunter's pot was the ultimate expression of this philosophy. A cauldron would be kept simmering constantly, with new ingredients added as old ones were consumed. In theory, this created a continuously evolving dish that never ran out and never repeated itself exactly. In practice, it created a breeding ground for bacteria and a container for ingredients of questionable origin and doubtful freshness. The base of most potages was grain, barley, oats, wheat, or whatever was cheapest and most available. This provided bulk and calories, turning what might otherwise be a thin broth into a substantial meal. Vegetables were added when available: onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, carrots, and whatever else could be found in the market or gathered from the countryside. Meat, when it appeared in pottage, was often of uncertain origin and questionable quality. Beef, pork, mutton, and chicken were the most common, but rabbit, deer, and other game might find their way into the pot when available. The meat was typically tough, stringy, and well past its prime, the kind of cuts that required long, slow cooking to become even slightly edible. But it wasn't just the quality of the meat that was concerning, it was the source. Tavern keepers were not above using meat that had been rejected by other buyers, animals that had died of disease, or cuts that had been sitting in the market for days without finding a buyer. The long cooking process would kill most harmful bacteria, but it couldn't eliminate the off flavors and textures that came with spoiled meat. Fish was another common ingredient, especially during Lent and other periods when the church prohibited the consumption of meat. But medieval preservation techniques were primitive, and fish that had traveled any distance from the sea was likely to be heavily salted, dried, or pickled. Fresh fish was a luxury that few taverns could afford, and even when available, it had to be consumed quickly before it spoiled. The seasonings used in pottage reflected both availability and affordability. Salt was expensive and heavily taxed, making it a precious commodity that was used sparingly. Herbs like parsley, thyme, and sage might be added when available, either fresh from gardens or dried from the previous season. Spices were largely beyond the reach of most tavern keepers, though a successful establishment might occasionally splurge on pepper, ginger, or other exotic flavorings. The cooking process itself was full of hazards. The great cauldrons used for pottage were difficult to clean thoroughly, and residue from previous batches could contaminate new ones. The fires used for cooking were smoky and unpredictable, making it difficult to maintain consistent temperatures. Stirring was done with long wooden spoons that might not be cleaned between uses, spreading flavors and bacteria from one batch to the next. Bread was the other staple of tavern meals, but like everything else, its quality varied enormously. The best taverns might serve white bread made from wheat flour, a luxury that was soft, flavorful, and relatively fresh. More commonly, customers received brown bread made from barley, rye, or mixed grains, often several days old and hard enough to use as a weapon. The worst bread was made from whatever grain was cheapest, often mixed with sawdust, ground acorns, or other fillers to stretch the flour. This bread was dense, gritty, and barely edible, but it provided calories and helped fill empty stomachs. It was often used as a trencher, an edible plate on which other foods were served, and by the end of the meal, it had absorbed enough juices and flavors to become somewhat palatable. Cheese was another common offering, ranging from fresh, soft varieties that had to be consumed quickly to aged hard cheeses that could last for months. The quality depended on the source. Cheese made from the milk of healthy animals by skilled cheesemakers could be delicious, while cheese made from questionable milk by inexperienced hands could be inedible or even dangerous. Eggs, when available, were a welcome addition to the tavern menu. They could be boiled, fried, or added to pottage to provide protein and richness. But eggs were perishable, and without refrigeration, it was difficult to tell fresh eggs from spoiled ones until they were cracked open. A bad egg could ruin an entire dish and leave customers with vivid memories of their tavern experience. Vegetables were seasonal and often scarce, especially during the winter months when fresh produce was unavailable. Root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and carrots could be stored for months in cool cellars, but they often became soft, sprouted, or partially rotten before they were used. Cabbage could be preserved by fermentation, creating sauerkraut that provided vitamins and flavor during the lean months. The preparation of food in medieval taverns was a communal affair with multiple dishes being prepared simultaneously in the same kitchen space. Cross-contamination was inevitable as the same utensils, cutting boards, and preparation surfaces were used for different ingredients without proper cleaning between uses. Raw meat might be prepared on the same surface as bread. Vegetables might be washed in the same water used for cleaning dishes, and cooked food might be stored alongside raw ingredients. Preservation was a constant challenge. Without refrigeration, food had to be consumed quickly or preserved through salting, smoking, drying, or fermentation. These preservation methods changed the flavor and texture of food dramatically, often making it barely recognizable from its fresh state. Salt pork bore little resemblance to fresh pork. Dried fish was a completely different experience from fresh fish, and fermented vegetables had flavors that could be challenging even for medieval palates. The serving of food was as haphazard as its preparation. Dishes were often shared among multiple customers, with everyone eating from the same bowl or platter. Personal hygiene was poor, and the concept of individual place settings was unknown. Customers ate with their hands, shared knives, and drank from communal cups, spreading diseases and parasites with every meal. Despite all these challenges, tavern food served an important social and nutritional function. For many people, especially those living in cities, the tavern meal was their primary source of hot-cooked food. It provided calories, protein, and at least some vitamins and minerals that might be lacking in their regular diet. It was also a social experience, bringing people together around shared tables and creating opportunities for conversation, business, and community building. The successful tavern keeper understood that food was about more than just nutrition. It was about hospitality, comfort, and the creation of an atmosphere that would keep customers coming back. A bowl of well-made pottage served hot and accompanied by fresh bread and good ale could transform a cold, wet, miserable day into something bearable. It might not have been gourmet cuisine, but it was sustenance for both body and soul. Step into any medieval tavern, and you'd find yourself surrounded by a cast of characters that would make a modern crime novelist weep with envy. These weren't the sanitized peasants and noble knights of romantic literature, but real people living on the margins of society, each with their own story, their own agenda, and their own particular brand of danger. The merchants were perhaps the most visible and vocal of the tavern's regular patrons. These men, and they were almost exclusively men, traveled the dangerous roads between towns and cities, carrying goods, news, and often substantial amounts of coin. They were natural storytellers, entertaining anyone who would listen with tales of distant markets, exotic goods, and the dangers of the road. But beneath their jolly exteriors lay sharp minds constantly calculating profit and loss, and eyes that missed nothing of value. A successful merchant in a medieval tavern was like a walking advertisement for prosperity. Dressed in fine clothes, sporting jewelry that proclaimed his wealth, and speaking with the confidence of a man who had seen the world beyond the village boundaries, but this display of wealth made him a target for every pickpocket, conman, and outright robber in the establishment. Smart merchants traveled in groups, hired guards, and kept their most valuable possessions hidden. But even the most cautious could find themselves relieved of their goods by a clever thief or a well-planned ambush. The less successful merchants were often more dangerous than their prosperous counterparts. Desperate men with failing businesses, mounting debts, and families to feed were capable of almost anything. They might sell goods they didn't own, promise deliveries they couldn't make, or enter into partnerships with criminals to recover their losses. A merchant on the edge of bankruptcy was a man with nothing left to lose, and such men were unpredictable and potentially violent. Soldiers were another common sight in medieval taverns, and their presence could either ensure peace or guarantee trouble depending on their mood, their sobriety, and their recent experiences. Veterans of foreign wars brought with them not just scars and stories, but also a casual attitude toward violence that could turn a simple disagreement into a bloodbath. They were skilled with weapons, accustomed to taking what they needed, and often suffering from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The best soldiers were disciplined professionals who understood that their reputation was their most valuable asset. They might be hired as guards, escorts, or enforcers, and their presence in a tavern could actually make it safer for other patrons. But even good soldiers could be pushed too far, especially when drink loosened their inhibitions and old grievances surfaced. The worst soldiers were little better than bandits, with military training, deserters, discharged veterans with no other skills, and mercenaries between contracts often turned to crime to survive. They knew how to fight, how to kill, and how to intimidate, making them formidable opponents for anyone foolish enough to cross them. A tavern full of unemployed soldiers was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Pilgrims represented a different kind of danger, not physical violence, but moral corruption. These supposedly holy travelers were often the most worldly people in the tavern, having seen more of life than the local residents could imagine. Some were genuine seekers of spiritual enlightenment, but others were using pilgrimage as an excuse for adventure, escape from legal troubles, or simply an extended vacation from the responsibilities of home. The Canterbury Tales gives us a vivid picture of medieval pilgrims, and it's not always flattering. Chaucer's pilgrims include a corrupt pardoner selling fake relics, a summoner who takes bribes to overlook sins, and a wife of Bath who has buried 5 husbands and is looking for number 6. These were people who understood how to manipulate religious sentiment for personal gain, and they were often more dangerous than the obvious criminals, because they hid their true nature behind a facade of piety. Craftsmen and artisans formed another significant group in the tavern population. These skilled workers, blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, potters, and dozens of other trades, were the backbone of medieval economy. They were generally more prosperous than common laborers, but less wealthy than successful merchants, occupying a middle ground that made them both envied and resented by those above and below them on the social ladder. Guild membership gave craftsmen a certain status and protection, but it also created rivalries and conflicts that could spill over into violence. Different guilds competed for customers, disputed territorial boundaries, and fought over the right to practice certain trades. A tavern might become neutral ground where these disputes could be settled, or it might become a battlefield where old grudges were settled with fists and knives. The most dangerous craftsmen were those who had been expelled from their guilds, or who practiced their trades without proper authorization. These men had skills, but no legitimate way to use them, making them natural recruits for criminal enterprises. A blacksmith who could forge weapons and pick locks, a carpenter who could build secret compartments and hidden passages, or a weaver who could create disguises and false documents. All were valuable assets to the criminal underworld. Clergy were surprisingly common in medieval taverns despite official church disapproval of such places. Parish priests, traveling monks, and minor church officials often found themselves in taverns either by necessity or by choice. Some were genuinely pious men who had no other option for food and shelter during their travels. Others were using their religious status as a cover for less holy activities. The corrupt clergyman was a stock character in medieval literature, but he was also a real presence in medieval taverns. These men had education, connections, and moral authority that they could use for personal gain. They might sell false indulgences, perform illegal marriages, or provide sanctuary to criminals in exchange for payment. Their presence in a tavern could legitimize the establishment in the eyes of some customers while making others deeply suspicious. Women in medieval taverns occupied a complex and often dangerous position. The alewives who ran many establishments were businesswomen in their own right, but they were also vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or other crimes that could destroy their reputations and their livelihoods. Serving wenches faced constant harassment and the threat of sexual violence, while prostitutes operated in a legal gray area that left them at the mercy of both customers and authorities. But medieval women were not passive victims. Many were skilled in the use of knives, poisons, and other weapons, and they were often more ruthless than their male counterparts when threatened. A tavern keeper's wife might be the real power behind the establishment, using her knowledge of customers' secrets and weaknesses to maintain order and extract payment. Female criminals often used their supposed weakness and innocence as weapons, luring victims into traps or manipulating men into doing their bidding. Thieves and pickpockets were the most obvious criminals in any tavern, but they were also often the most skilled at blending in with legitimate customers. The best thieves were indistinguishable from honest merchants, craftsmen, or travelers until the moment they struck. They studied their victims carefully, learning their habits, their weaknesses, and the location of their valuables before making their move. Professional thieves often worked in teams with one member, creating a distraction while another picked pockets or cut purse strings. They might pose as fellow travelers, sympathetic listeners, or potential business partners to get close to their victims. The most successful thieves were those who could steal without their victims even realizing they had been robbed until hours or days later. But not all thieves were professionals. Desperate people driven to crime by poverty, debt, or other circumstances were often clumsy and dangerous. They might resort to violence when stealth failed, turning a simple theft into assault or murder. These amateur criminals were unpredictable and often more dangerous than their professional counterparts because they had no reputation to protect and no code of conduct to follow. The tavern keeper himself was often the most dangerous person in the establishment. He controlled the environment, knew all the customers, and had the authority to settle disputes or call for help from local authorities. But he was also a businessman operating in a gray area of the law, and his survival depended on his ability to balance the competing interests of customers, suppliers, and officials. A corrupt tavern keeper might sell stolen goods, provide alibis for criminals, or arrange for the elimination of troublesome customers. He might water down drinks, serve spoiled food, or charge excessive prices to customers who were too drunk or too intimidated to complain. His establishment might serve as a meeting place for criminal conspiracies, a safe house for fugitives, or a base of operations for organized crime. But even honest tavern keepers had to make moral compromises to survive. They might look the other way when crimes were committed on their premises, accept payment from criminals for their silence, or provide services that were technically illegal but widely accepted. The line between legitimate business and criminal enterprise was often blurred beyond recognition. This rogues gallery of medieval tavern patrons created an atmosphere of constant tension and unpredictability. Alliances formed and dissolved based on immediate needs and opportunities. Trust was a luxury that few could afford, and betrayal was always just a drink away. In this environment, survival depended on one's ability to read people quickly, assess threats accurately, and respond appropriately to changing circumstances. The social dynamics of the medieval tavern were complex and ever-shifting. Status, wealth, and power were constantly being negotiated and renegotiated through subtle displays of dominance, submission, and alliance. A single misunderstood gesture, an ill-timed joke, or a perceived slight could escalate into violence that might leave several people dead and the survivors facing charges of murder. Yet for all its dangers, the medieval tavern served an important social function. It was one of the few places where people from different social classes, professions, and backgrounds could interact on relatively equal terms. A merchant might share a table with a craftsman, a soldier might drink with a priest, and a noble might find himself gambling with a thief. These interactions, however brief and shallow, helped to break down some of the rigid social barriers that characterized medieval society. The tavern was also a place where information flowed freely. News, gossip, rumors, and secrets were traded like commodities, and a skilled listener could learn more in a single evening than he might discover in weeks of formal inquiry. This made the tavern valuable to merchants seeking market information, officials gathering intelligence, and criminals planning their next moves. In the flickering candlelight of medieval taverns, fortunes were won and lost with the roll of dice, the turn of a card, or the outcome of contests that tested both skill and luck. Gambling wasn't just entertainment, it was a way of life, a means of social advancement, and often a path to ruin that claimed victims from every level of society. Dice were the most popular gambling tools in medieval taverns, and for good reason. They were small, portable, and could be made from readily available materials like bone, wood, or stone. The basic concept was simple enough that even the most illiterate peasant could understand it, yet complex enough to sustain interest through long nights of play. But medieval dice games were far from the standardized casino games of today. They were wild, unpredictable affairs where the rules changed with the players, and cheating was considered more of an art form than a crime. The most common dice game was hazard, a predecessor to modern craps that involved betting on the outcome of 2 dice throws. The player would call a number between 5 and 9 as his main, then attempt to roll that number before rolling certain other combinations that would cause him to lose. It sounds simple, but the betting possibilities were endless, with side bets on individual throws, sequences of throws, and the performance of other players, creating a complex web of financial obligations that could bankrupt a man in minutes. But hazard was just one of dozens of dice games played in medieval taverns. There was raffle, where players tried to throw 3 dice and get all the same number. There was mum chance, a game so dependent on luck that it became synonymous with random fortune. There was passage, where players bet on whether they could throw doubles with 2 dice. Each game had its own rules, its own betting structure, and its own opportunities for skilled players to gain an advantage over their opponents. The dice themselves were often works of art, carved from the bones of exotic animals, or crafted from precious materials like ivory or jet. Wealthy players might own sets of dice made from different materials for different games, while poor players made do with crude wooden cubes that were barely symmetrical. But regardless of their construction, all dice were suspect. Loaded dice, shaved dice, and dice with duplicate numbers were common, and players developed elaborate rituals for inspecting dice before play began. The most skilled dice players were those who could cheat without being detected. They might use sleight of hand to substitute loaded dice for fair ones, employ confederates to distract other players at crucial moments, or use subtle signals to coordinate their betting with accomplices. The best cheaters were so skilled that they could manipulate the outcome of games while appearing to be the victims of bad luck themselves. But dice weren't the only gambling games in medieval taverns. Cards, though less common than dice, were growing in popularity throughout the later medieval period. The earliest playing cards were hand-painted works of art that were far too expensive for common use. But by the 14th century, printed cards were becoming more affordable and widespread. Medieval card games bore little resemblance to modern poker or blackjack. They were often based on matching suits or sequences with complex scoring systems that rewarded both luck and skill. Primero, an ancestor of poker, involved betting on the strength of one's hand. But the hand rankings were different from modern poker, and the betting structure was more fluid and unpredictable. The most dangerous aspect of medieval card games wasn't the games themselves, but the accusations of cheating that inevitably arose. Marked cards, dealing from the bottom of the deck, and collusion between players were common, but proving cheating was difficult and often led to violence. A player accused of cheating might find himself facing not just the loss of his winnings, but a knife in the ribs or a challenge to single combat. Beyond dice and cards, medieval taverns hosted a bewildering variety of gambling activities. Arm wrestling contests, drinking competitions, and tests of skill or knowledge all became opportunities for betting. Customers might bet on which of 2 flies would reach the ceiling first, whether the next person through the door would be male or female, or how many beans were in a jar. Anything that had an uncertain outcome could become the subject of a wager. Cockfighting was particularly popular in taverns that had outdoor space or could accommodate the noise and mess of the sport. 2 roosters, specially bred and trained for fighting, would be placed in a pit while spectators bet on the outcome. The fights were brutal and often ended in the death of one or both birds, but the excitement and betting opportunities made them irresistible to many tavern patrons. Bear baiting and bull baiting were less common, but even more spectacular. A bear or bull would be chained to a post and attacked by specially trained dogs while spectators bet on various aspects of the contest. Which dog would draw first blood? How long the bear would survive? Whether any of the dogs would be killed? These events were expensive to organize and required special facilities, so they were usually reserved for special occasions or particularly prosperous establishments. The social dynamics of gambling in medieval taverns were complex and often dangerous. Winning too much too quickly could mark a player as a cheater or a target for robbery. Losing too much could lead to desperate attempts to recover losses that often ended in violence or crime. The most successful gamblers were those who could win consistently without appearing to be too skilled or too lucky. Professional gamblers known as dicers or card sharps traveled from tavern to tavern, making their living from their skill at games of chance. They were often welcomed by tavern keepers because they attracted customers and generated business. But they were also viewed with suspicion by local players who resented being outplayed by outsiders. The best professional gamblers were those who could lose gracefully when necessary, winning just enough to make a living without arousing too much suspicion or resentment. But gambling in medieval taverns wasn't just about money. Social status, reputation, and honor were also at stake. A nobleman who lost consistently to a peasant might find his social standing damaged, while a merchant who was caught cheating might find his business reputation ruined. The stakes were often higher than the actual money involved, and the consequences of losing could extend far beyond the tavern walls. Women participated in gambling as well, though their involvement was often more subtle and indirect than that of men. Alewives might organize games in their establishments, taking a percentage of the winnings as payment for providing the venue. Serving wenches might act as lookouts for cheaters or carry messages between players and their confederates. Prostitutes might use their intimate relationships with customers to gain information about their gambling habits and financial resources. The church officially condemned gambling as a sin, but this prohibition was widely ignored by both clergy and lay people. Many priests and monks were known to be avid gamblers, and some taverns even hosted special games during religious festivals. The church's opposition to gambling was based more on its association with other vices, drinking, fighting, and sexual immorality, than on any inherent evil in games of chance themselves. Local authorities had a more practical approach to gambling. They recognized that it was impossible to eliminate entirely, so they focused on regulating it to prevent the worst abuses. Laws were passed limiting the stakes that could be wagered, prohibiting certain types of games, and requiring tavern keepers to maintain order during gambling sessions. But enforcement was sporadic and often corrupt, with officials taking bribes to look the other way or participating in the games themselves. The economic impact of gambling on medieval society was significant. Large sums of money changed hands regularly, creating winners and losers whose fortunes could change overnight. Successful gamblers might use their winnings to invest in legitimate businesses, while losers might be forced to sell their possessions, borrow money at high rates, or turn to crime to pay their debts. Gambling debts were a particular problem because they were often not legally enforceable. A man who lost money gambling might simply refuse to pay, leaving his creditors with no legal recourse. This led to the development of informal enforcement mechanisms, threats, violence, and social exclusion that were often more effective than legal remedies, but also more dangerous for all involved. The psychology of gambling in medieval taverns was shaped by the harsh realities of medieval life. For most people, life was a constant struggle against poverty, disease, and early death. Gambling offered the possibility, however remote, of escaping these constraints through a single lucky throw of the dice or turn of the cards. It was a form of hope, however irrational, that tomorrow might be better than today. But gambling also reflected the medieval understanding of fate and fortune in a world where random events, plague, war, famine, natural disasters could destroy lives without warning. The idea that luck played a major role in human affairs was widely accepted. Gambling was simply a way of trying to influence or predict the workings of fate, a form of fortune-telling disguised as entertainment. The rituals and superstitions surrounding gambling in medieval taverns were elaborate and deeply ingrained. Players might carry lucky charms, perform specific rituals before throwing dice, or refuse to play on certain days or under certain conditions. Dice might be blessed by priests, cards might be stored in special containers, and gaming tables might be consecrated with holy water or marked with protective symbols. These superstitions weren't just quaint customs. They were serious attempts to influence the outcome of games through supernatural means. In a world where magic and religion were intertwined with daily life, the idea that spiritual forces could affect the fall of dice or the turn of cards was perfectly reasonable. Players who ignored these rituals did so at their own peril, not just because they might be unlucky, but because other players might view their skepticism as dangerous or impure. The language of gambling permeated medieval culture, providing metaphors and expressions that are still used today. To cast the die meant to make an irrevocable decision, while the die is cast indicated that events had been set in motion that could not be stopped. A dicey situation was one where the outcome was uncertain, while someone who was on a roll was experiencing a streak of good luck. These linguistic connections reflected the central role that gambling played in medieval life. It wasn't just a pastime or a vice. It was a fundamental part of how people understood and interacted with the world around them. The tavern was where this understanding was tested, refined, and sometimes shattered by the cruel realities of chance and human nature. Violence in medieval taverns wasn't an abnormality. It was an integral part of the social fabric, as expected and inevitable as the sunrise. In a world where might often made right and personal honor was worth more than life itself, the tavern served as both pressure valve and proving ground for the aggressive impulses that simmered beneath the surface of medieval society. The causes of tavern violence were as varied as the people who frequented these establishments. A perceived slight, a disputed debt, a woman's honor, a political disagreement, or simply too much ale could spark a confrontation that might end in bloodshed. But understanding the triggers was less important than understanding the culture that made violence not just acceptable, but often necessary for survival and social standing. Honor was the currency of medieval society, and it was a currency that could be devalued by a single moment of perceived cowardice or disrespect. A man who allowed himself to be insulted without response might find his reputation permanently damaged, affecting not just his social standing, but his ability to conduct business, attract a wife, or command respect from his peers. In this context, violence wasn't just an option. It was often the only option for maintaining one's place in society. The weapons available in medieval taverns were limited by law and custom, but creativity and desperation could turn almost anything into an instrument of death. Knives were the most common weapons carried by virtually everyone for eating and general utility. These weren't the small table knives of modern times, but substantial blades capable of causing serious wounds. A skilled knife fighter could kill an opponent in seconds, while even an amateur could cause significant damage in the close quarters of a crowded tavern. Swords were less common in taverns, partly because they were expensive, and partly because they were often restricted by law to members of the nobility and military. But when swords did appear in tavern fights, the results were usually spectacular and bloody. The confined space of a tavern made sword fighting particularly dangerous for bystanders, as wild swings could easily strike innocent customers or cause structural damage to the building. More commonly, tavern fighters made do with improvised weapons. Wooden stools became clubs, pottery shards became cutting tools, and even eating utensils could be pressed into service as weapons. The heavy pewter or wooden tankards used for drinking ale were particularly effective as bludgeons, capable of crushing skulls or breaking bones with a single well-placed blow. The fighting styles employed in medieval taverns were brutal and practical, focused on ending conflicts quickly rather than demonstrating skill or following rules of chivalry. Grappling, gouging, biting, and kicking were all acceptable tactics, and fighters often aimed for vulnerable areas like the eyes, throat, and groin. The goal wasn't to wound or disable an opponent, but to kill or incapacitate him before he could do the same to you. Group fights were particularly chaotic and dangerous. What might start as a dispute between two individuals could quickly escalate into a general brawl involving dozens of people. Alliances formed and dissolved in seconds as customers chose sides based on personal relationships, ethnic loyalties, or simple proximity to the action. In these situations, survival often depended more on luck than skill, as fighters struggled to avoid being overwhelmed by multiple opponents or struck by flying objects. The role of women in tavern violence was complex and often underestimated by modern observers. While women were less likely to engage in direct physical confrontation, they were often the instigators of violence, using their relationships with men to manipulate conflicts for their own benefit. A woman might encourage her lover to fight a rival, provide weapons or information to one side in a conflict, or use accusations of sexual impropriety to destroy an enemy's reputation. When women did engage in physical violence, they were often more vicious and unpredictable than their male counterparts. Female tavern keepers were known for their ability to maintain order through a combination of intimidation and violence, wielding rolling pins, ladles, and other kitchen implements with deadly efficiency. Serving wenches learned to defend themselves against unwanted advances, using whatever weapons were at hand, and their intimate knowledge of the tavern's layout gave them significant advantages in close combat. The aftermath of tavern violence was often as dangerous as the violence itself. Wounded fighters might die from their injuries days or weeks later, turning what had seemed like a minor fight into a case of murder. Families and friends of the injured or killed might seek revenge, creating cycles of violence that could persist for generations. Legal authorities might become involved, leading to trials, executions, or other forms of official punishment that could destroy entire families. The economic consequences of tavern violence were also significant. Property damage from fights had to be repaired or replaced, often at considerable expense. Injured customers might be unable to work, affecting their ability to pay debts or support their families. Dead customers obviously couldn't pay their bills, leaving tavern keepers to absorb the losses. The reputation of a tavern where violence was common might suffer, driving away customers and reducing profits. But violence also served important social functions in medieval taverns. It was a way of establishing and maintaining social hierarchies with stronger or more skilled fighters, earning respect and deference from their peers. It was a form of entertainment for spectators who might bet on the outcome of fights or simply enjoy the excitement of watching others risk their lives. It was a method of dispute resolution in a society where formal legal mechanisms were often unavailable or ineffective. The rituals surrounding tavern violence were as important as the violence itself. Challenges might be issued according to specific formulas with particular words or gestures that carried precise meanings. The choice of weapons, the location of the fight, and the presence or absence of witnesses all had significance that went beyond the immediate practical considerations. These rituals helped to legitimize violence and distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable forms of aggression. Professional fighters, including soldiers, mercenaries, and others whose livelihood depended on their combat skills, brought a different dynamic to tavern violence. They were often more skilled and experienced than ordinary customers, but they were also more likely to escalate conflicts beyond what the situation required. A professional fighter might see a tavern brawl as an opportunity to demonstrate his skills or enhance his reputation, leading to unnecessarily brutal or prolonged conflicts. The weapons and fighting techniques used by professionals were often superior to those employed by amateurs, but they were also more likely to result in serious injuries or deaths. A mercenary who had learned to fight on battlefields might not understand the unwritten rules that governed tavern violence, leading to conflicts that went far beyond what local customs considered appropriate. The seasonal patterns of tavern violence reflected the rhythms of medieval life. Violence was more common during certain times of year, harvest festivals, religious holidays, and market days when people had more money to spend on drink and more reasons to gather in large numbers. Winter months, when people were confined indoors and tensions ran high, also saw increased levels of violence. The time of day also affected the likelihood and severity of tavern violence. Early evening fights were often relatively minor affairs, settled quickly before they could escalate. But as the night wore on and customers became more drunk, conflicts became more serious and more likely to result in permanent injury or death. The hours just before dawn were particularly dangerous, as exhausted, drunk, and emotionally unstable customers were most likely to resort to extreme violence. The legal response to tavern violence varied widely depending on the jurisdiction, the social status of those involved, and the severity of the injuries inflicted. Minor fights might be ignored entirely by authorities, especially if no one was seriously injured and the participants were willing to settle their differences privately. More serious violence might result in fines, imprisonment, or even execution, particularly if the victim was a person of high social standing, or if the violence was seen as threatening public order. But the legal system's response to tavern violence was often inconsistent and corrupt. Wealthy or well-connected individuals might escape punishment for serious crimes, while poor or unpopular defendants might face severe penalties for minor offenses. Witnesses might be intimidated or bribed, evidence might be destroyed or fabricated, and judges might be influenced by personal relationships or financial considerations. The Church's attitude toward tavern violence was officially condemnatory, but practically ambivalent. While church doctrine condemned violence and promoted peace and reconciliation, many clergy members were themselves frequent participants in tavern culture and occasional participants in tavern violence. The Church's emphasis on concepts like just war and righteous anger provided theological justification for violence in certain circumstances, and the medieval understanding of honor and masculinity often conflicted with Christian ideals of humility and forgiveness. The medical treatment available for victims of tavern violence was primitive and often more dangerous than the original injuries. Wounds might be cleaned with wine or vinegar, sewn shut with whatever thread was available, and treated with herbal remedies of questionable effectiveness. Broken bones were set without anesthesia, and amputations were performed with crude tools and no understanding of antiseptic procedures. Many victims of tavern violence died not from their original injuries, but from infections, blood loss, or complications arising from inadequate medical treatment. Those who survived might be permanently disabled, affecting their ability to work and support themselves and their families. The long-term consequences of tavern violence thus extended far beyond the immediate participants, affecting entire communities and generations. The psychological impact of tavern violence on both participants and witnesses was significant but poorly understood in medieval times, what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder was common among those who had experienced or witnessed serious violence, but it was often attributed to moral weakness, divine punishment, or supernatural influences. The lack of effective treatment for psychological trauma meant that the effects of violence could persist for years or even decades. Despite all these negative consequences, violence remained an integral part of tavern culture throughout the medieval period. It was too deeply embedded in the social, economic, and psychological structures of medieval society to be eliminated by law, religion, or social pressure. The tavern provided a space where the violent impulses that were suppressed in other contexts could be expressed, and this function was as important to medieval society as the tavern's role in providing food, drink, and shelter. In the shadowy corners and upstairs rooms of medieval taverns, another ancient profession plied its trade with a mixture of desperation, cunning, and resigned acceptance of society's moral contradictions. Prostitution wasn't just tolerated in medieval taverns. It was often an integral part of the business model, providing additional income for tavern keepers and additional services for customers who had coin to spend and appetites to satisfy. The women who worked as prostitutes in medieval taverns came from all walks of life, though poverty was the common thread that bound their stories together. Some were widows who had lost their husbands to war, disease, or accident, and had no other means of supporting themselves and their children. Others were young women who had been seduced and abandoned, their reputations ruined, and their prospects for marriage destroyed. Still others were simply products of a society that offered few legitimate opportunities for women to earn a living wage. The Church officially condemned prostitution as a mortal sin, but even religious authorities recognized its practical necessity. St. Augustine had argued that prostitution was like sewers in a palace. unpleasant but necessary to prevent worse corruption. This pragmatic approach led to a complex system of regulation and tolerance that varied widely from place to place and time to time. In some cities, prostitution was completely legal and regulated by municipal authorities. Licensed brothels operated openly, their workers subject to regular health inspections, and required to dress in distinctive clothing that marked their profession. These establishments paid taxes, followed specific rules about their operations, and were generally accepted as a necessary evil by the broader community. But in taverns, the situation was more ambiguous. Prostitution might be tolerated as long as it was discreet, or it might be officially prohibited while being unofficially encouraged. Tavern keepers walked a fine line between maximizing their profits and avoiding legal troubles, often relying on bribes, political connections, or simple geographic isolation to protect their operations. The working conditions for prostitutes in medieval taverns were harsh and dangerous. They had little protection from violent or abusive customers, no recourse when clients refused to pay, and constant exposure to sexually transmitted diseases that could be disfiguring or fatal. Pregnancy was an occupational hazard that could end a woman's career, and the primitive methods of birth control and abortion available at the time were often more dangerous than childbirth itself. The economic arrangements between prostitutes and tavern keepers varied widely. Some women worked as independent contractors, renting rooms from the tavern keeper and keeping most of their earnings. Others were essentially employees, receiving a percentage of their fees, while the tavern keeper provided room, board, and protection. The worst situations involved women who were essentially slaves, trapped by debt, violence, or legal constraints that made it impossible for them to leave. The customers who sought the services of tavern prostitutes were as diverse as the women who served them. Merchants traveling far from home, soldiers on leave from military campaigns, craftsmen celebrating successful business deals, and local men seeking variety or excitement, all contributed to the demand for commercial sex. The anonymity of the tavern environment made it easier for men to engage in behavior that might be socially unacceptable in their home communities. The prices charged for sexual services varied based on the woman's appearance, age, and reputation, as well as the specific services requested and the economic conditions of the local area. A young, attractive woman in a prosperous city might command prices that would support her comfortably, while an older woman in a poor rural area might barely earn enough to survive. The most successful prostitutes were those who could attract regular customers willing to pay premium prices for exclusive access or special treatment. But prostitution in medieval taverns wasn't just about sex. It was about companionship, entertainment, and emotional connection. Many customers were lonely men, far from home, who valued conversation and affection as much as physical gratification. Successful prostitutes learned to be actresses, therapists, and confidants, as well as sexual partners, adapting their personalities to meet the emotional needs of their clients. The relationships between prostitutes and other tavern workers were complex and often strained. Serving wenches might resent the competition for customers' attention and money, while tavern keepers might play favorites among their workers to maximize profits. Male employees might take advantage of their positions to demand sexual favors, while female employees might form alliances for mutual protection and support. The legal status of prostitutes was precarious and constantly changing. They might be arrested and fined for practicing their trade, then released to continue working because the authorities recognized the impossibility of eliminating prostitution entirely. They might be required to live in specific areas of town, wear distinctive clothing, or submit to regular health inspections. In times of social or political upheaval, they might be scapegoated for broader problems and subjected to particularly harsh treatment. The health risks associated with prostitution in medieval times were enormous. Sexually transmitted diseases were common and often fatal with no effective treatments available. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other infections could cause blindness, insanity, and death, while pregnancy and childbirth carried their own substantial risks. The lack of understanding about disease transmission meant that both prostitutes and their customers were largely ignorant of the dangers they faced. Violence was another constant threat. Customers might become violent when drunk, refuse to pay for services, or assault prostitutes for reasons ranging from sexual frustration to religious guilt. The isolated nature of many taverns made it difficult for prostitutes to call for help, while their low social status meant that authorities were often reluctant to investigate crimes against them seriously. The psychological toll of prostitution was severe, but rarely acknowledged in medieval times. Women who entered the profession often experienced shame, depression, and a sense of hopelessness that was compounded by social exclusion and religious condemnation. The constant need to perform emotional and sexual labor for strangers, while suppressing their own feelings and desires, created psychological stress that had no recognized treatment or support. Despite these challenges, some prostitutes managed to achieve a measure of success and independence. The most skilled and fortunate might accumulate enough money to retire from active prostitution and establish themselves as madams, managing other women and taking a percentage of their earnings. Others might attract wealthy patrons who provided them with financial security in exchange for exclusive access to their services. The most successful prostitutes were often those who could transcend the purely sexual aspects of their work and establish themselves as entertainers, confidants, or even informal advisors to powerful men. These women might gain access to political information, business opportunities, or social connections that could be leveraged for personal advancement. But such success was rare and often temporary, dependent on maintaining the favor of fickle and powerful men. The children of prostitutes faced particular challenges in medieval society. They were often stigmatized by their mother's profession and had limited opportunities for social advancement. Boys might be apprenticed to trades or recruited into military service, while girls often followed their mothers into prostitution or other forms of service work. The cycle of poverty and social marginalization was difficult to break. The relationship between prostitution and other forms of crime was complex. Prostitutes might serve as informants for thieves and other criminals, using their intimate relationships with customers to gather information about their wealth, habits, and vulnerabilities. They might also be victims of crime, targeted by robbers who assumed they carried substantial amounts of cash, or by criminals who viewed them as easy targets, unlikely to receive protection from authorities. The seasonal patterns of prostitution in medieval taverns reflected broader economic and social cycles. Business was often better during harvest festivals, religious holidays, and market days when men had more money to spend and more reasons to celebrate. Military campaigns, trade expeditions, and other events that brought large numbers of men to an area could create temporary booms in demand for sexual services. The geographic distribution of prostitution also varied significantly. Urban taverns in major cities might support numerous prostitutes working in relative safety and prosperity, while rural establishments might have only one or two women working in more dangerous and isolated conditions. Port cities and major trade routes were particularly lucrative locations, as they attracted large numbers of travelers with money to spend. The regulation of prostitution by religious and secular authorities was often contradictory and hypocritical. The same officials who publicly condemned prostitution might privately patronize prostitutes or profit from their activities through taxation or corruption. The church might preach against sexual immorality while tolerating or even profiting from brothels located on church property. The impact of prostitution on medieval society extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. It affected marriage patterns, family structures, and social relationships in ways that were often subtle but significant. The availability of commercial sex might reduce pressure on unmarried women to engage in premarital sex, but it might also reduce men's incentives to marry and establish families. The economic impact of prostitution was also significant. It represented a substantial underground economy that generated income for women, tavern keepers, and various intermediaries, while also creating demand for goods and services, ranging from clothing and cosmetics to food and lodging. The money spent on prostitution might otherwise have been saved or spent on other goods and services, affecting the broader economy in complex ways. The cultural impact of prostitution was perhaps most significant of all. It challenged conventional notions of female virtue and male honor while simultaneously reinforcing them. It provided an outlet for sexual desires that might otherwise have been expressed in more socially disruptive ways. But it also created a class of women who were permanently marginalized and stigmatized. The stories of individual prostitutes who worked in medieval taverns are largely lost to history, their voices silenced by illiteracy, social stigma, and the general tendency of historical records to ignore the experiences of marginalized people. But their presence in these establishments was a constant reminder of the harsh realities of medieval life and the limited options available to women who found themselves outside the protection of family, marriage, or religious institutions. Justice in medieval taverns was a complex and often contradictory affair where official law enforcement competed with unofficial systems of order, and where the line between legal authority and criminal enterprise was often blurred beyond recognition. The tavern existed in a legal gray area, simultaneously subject to royal authority, church jurisdiction, guild regulations, and local customs that might contradict each other in fundamental ways. The most visible representatives of official law enforcement were the constables, bailiffs, and other officers who were responsible for maintaining order in their jurisdictions. These men were often part-time officials who combined law enforcement duties with other occupations, and their effectiveness varied widely based on their personal courage, political connections, and financial resources. A strong, well-connected constable might be able to maintain order in even the most unruly tavern, while a weak or corrupt official might find himself ignored or even physically threatened by the very people he was supposed to control. The powers of these officials were extensive in theory, but limited in practice. They could arrest suspected criminals, confiscate property, and impose fines for various offenses. But their ability to enforce these powers depended on their personal authority and the support of the local community. A constable who tried to arrest a popular local figure might find himself facing a hostile crowd, while one who targeted unpopular outsiders might receive enthusiastic support from tavern patrons. The crimes that law enforcement officials were most concerned with in taverns were those that threatened public order or royal authority. Treason, sedition, and other political crimes were taken very seriously, as were violent crimes that resulted in serious injury or death. Property crimes like theft and fraud were also prosecuted, though the effectiveness of enforcement varied widely based on the value of the stolen goods and the social status of the victims. But many activities that would be considered criminal today were either legal or tolerated in medieval taverns. Gambling was officially prohibited in many jurisdictions, but widely practiced and rarely prosecuted. Prostitution might be regulated rather than banned, with officials more concerned about taxation and health issues than moral considerations. Even violence might be overlooked if it was seen as a legitimate response to provocation or if the participants were willing to settle their differences privately. The church had its own system of law enforcement that operated parallel to secular authorities. Canon law governed many aspects of medieval life, including marriage, sexual behavior, and religious observance, and church officials had the authority to investigate and punish violations of these laws. Taverns were particular targets of church enforcement because they were associated with many activities that the church considered sinful: drinking, gambling, prostitution, and violence. Church officials might conduct raids on taverns, arresting customers for various moral offenses, and imposing penances or fines as punishment. They might also pressure secular authorities to close establishments that were seen as particularly problematic, or to impose stricter regulations on tavern operations. But the church's enforcement efforts were often hampered by the same practical limitations that affected secular authorities: limited resources, competing priorities, and the difficulty of changing deeply ingrained social behaviors. The guild system provided another layer of law enforcement that affected tavern operations. Guilds had the authority to regulate their members' business practices, set prices and quality standards, and punish violations of guild rules. Tavern keepers who were guild members might find themselves subject to guild discipline for various offenses, while those who operated outside the guild system might face harassment or boycotts organized by guild members. The most effective form of law enforcement in medieval taverns was often the informal system of social control, exercised by the tavern keeper and regular customers. A strong tavern keeper could maintain order through a combination of personal authority, physical intimidation, and economic incentives, while regular customers might police each other's behavior to protect their favorite establishment from official interference. This informal system of justice operated according to its own rules and procedures, which might bear little resemblance to official legal processes. Disputes might be settled through negotiation, compensation, or ritualized combat, with the tavern keeper serving as judge, jury, and executioner. Punishments might range from public humiliation and temporary banishment to physical violence and even death, depending on the severity of the offense and the preferences of those in authority. The relationship between official and unofficial law enforcement was complex and often symbiotic. Official authorities might rely on tavern keepers to maintain order and report serious crimes, while tavern keepers might call on official authorities when faced with problems they couldn't handle themselves. But this cooperation was always fragile and could break down quickly if the interests of the two systems came into conflict. Corruption was widespread in medieval law enforcement, and taverns were both a source and a target of corrupt practices. Officials might accept bribes to overlook illegal activities, participate in the profits of criminal enterprises, or use their authority to extort money from tavern keepers and customers. Tavern keepers might pay protection money to avoid harassment, provide free food and drink to curry favor with officials, or offer sexual services as a form of payment. The most corrupt officials were those who used their positions to engage in criminal activities themselves. A constable might organize theft rings, a bailiff might run illegal gambling operations, or a church official might profit from prostitution while publicly condemning it. These officials were often more dangerous than ordinary criminals because they had legal authority to cover up their crimes and punish those who opposed them. The legal procedures used to prosecute crimes in medieval taverns were often crude and unreliable by modern standards. Evidence might consist of little more than witness testimony, which could be influenced by personal relationships, financial incentives, or simple fear. Physical evidence was rarely collected or preserved systematically, and the concept of forensic investigation was virtually unknown. Trials were often public spectacles that served as much to entertain the community as to determine guilt or innocence. The accused might be required to undergo various forms of ordeal: trial by combat, trial by fire, or trial by water, that were believed to reveal divine judgment about their guilt or innocence. These procedures were based on religious beliefs rather than rational investigation, and their outcomes were often determined more by chance than by actual guilt or innocence. The punishments imposed for crimes committed in medieval taverns were designed to serve multiple purposes: deterrence, retribution, and public entertainment. Public executions, floggings, and other forms of corporal punishment were common, often carried out in market squares or other public spaces where large crowds could gather to watch. These spectacles served to reinforce social hierarchies and moral boundaries while providing entertainment for the masses. But punishment was also highly variable and often arbitrary. The same crime might result in a small fine for a wealthy merchant and death for a poor peasant, depending on the social status of the offender, the political climate, and the personal preferences of the judge. Justice was not blind in medieval times. It was acutely aware of social distinctions and power relationships. The effectiveness of law enforcement in medieval taverns was limited by numerous practical constraints. Communication was slow and unreliable, making it difficult to coordinate enforcement efforts across different jurisdictions. Transportation was expensive and dangerous, limiting the ability of officials to respond quickly to problems in remote areas. Record-keeping was primitive, making it difficult to track repeat offenders or identify patterns of criminal activity. The social attitudes toward law enforcement were also complex and often contradictory. While people generally supported the idea of maintaining order and punishing criminals, they were often suspicious of official authority and resentful of interference in their daily lives. A tavern customer might applaud the arrest of a thief who had stolen his purse, but object strenuously to enforcement of laws against gambling or drinking. The economic incentives surrounding law enforcement were often perverse. Officials were frequently paid through fees and fines rather than regular salaries, creating incentives to arrest and prosecute people regardless of their actual guilt. Tavern keepers might find it cheaper to pay bribes than to comply with regulations, while customers might prefer to settle disputes privately rather than involve official authorities, who might impose additional costs and complications. The geographic distribution of law enforcement resources was highly uneven. Major cities might have relatively sophisticated systems of law enforcement with multiple officials, established procedures, and regular patrols, while rural areas might have only a single part-time constable responsible for dozens of villages and hundreds of square miles. Taverns in remote areas might operate with virtual impunity, while those in major cities might face constant scrutiny and harassment. The seasonal patterns of law enforcement reflected broader social and economic cycles. Officials might be more active during harvest festivals and other times when large crowds gathered and tensions ran high, while enforcement might be relaxed during winter months when travel was difficult and criminal activity was reduced. Military campaigns and other major events might draw law enforcement resources away from routine duties, creating opportunities for increased criminal activity. The long-term effectiveness of medieval law enforcement in taverns is difficult to assess, but it seems clear that it was only partially successful in achieving its stated goals. Crime continued to be a major problem throughout the medieval period, and taverns remained centers of illegal and semi-legal activity despite repeated efforts to regulate them. But law enforcement did serve important social functions, providing a mechanism for resolving disputes, maintaining social hierarchies, and reinforcing moral boundaries even when it failed to eliminate criminal behavior entirely. As dawn broke over the medieval world, painting the sky in shades of gray and gold, the taverns that had pulsed with life throughout the night began their slow transformation back to something resembling respectability. But the evidence of the previous evening's activities lingered like smoke in the rafters. Bloodstains on the floor, broken furniture in the corners, and the hollow-eyed stares of those who had gambled away their futures on the turn of a card or the roll of dice. The morning after was when the true cost of tavern life became apparent. Bodies had to be removed, some merely unconscious from drink, others permanently silenced by violence. Debts had to be collected or forgiven depending on the debtor's ability to pay and the creditor's capacity for mercy. Reputations had to be rebuilt or abandoned as word of the night's events spread through the community like ripples on a pond. For the tavern keeper, morning brought the grim arithmetic of profit and loss. How much had been earned from food, drink, and other services? How much had been lost to theft, damage, and unpaid bills? How many customers had been gained or lost based on the previous night's events? The successful tavern keeper was one who could balance these competing factors, while maintaining the delicate ecosystem that made his establishment profitable. The cleanup process was both physical and social. Floors had to be swept, furniture repaired, and supplies replenished. But more importantly, relationships had to be mended, alliances renegotiated, and the complex web of obligations and expectations that held the tavern community together had to be A fight between two regular customers might require weeks of careful diplomacy to resolve, while a single act of betrayal could destroy years of carefully built trust. The women who worked in the tavern, whether as servers, cooks, or prostitutes, faced their own particular challenges in the morning light. Bruises had to be hidden, torn clothing mended, and the psychological wounds of the previous night's encounters somehow processed and compartmentalized. For many of these women, each new day brought the same choice: continue in a life that offered little hope of improvement, or risk everything on an uncertain alternative. The customers who had survived the night faced their own reckonings. Merchants had to assess whether their business dealings had been profitable or disastrous. Soldiers had to determine whether their reputations had been enhanced or damaged by their actions. Craftsmen had to return to their workshops and try to focus on their trades despite hangovers, injuries, and the lingering effects of whatever substances they had consumed. But perhaps the most profound reckoning was the one that took place in the minds and souls of those who had participated in tavern life. In the harsh light of day, actions that had seemed reasonable or even heroic in the flickering candlelight of the tavern might appear sordid or shameful. Promises made in the heat of passion or the fog of drink might prove impossible to keep. Alliances forged in the crucible of shared danger might crumble under the weight of sober reflection. The Church, which had officially condemned tavern culture, while often participating in it unofficially, offered its own form of reckoning through the sacrament of confession. Priests who had themselves been tavern patrons the night before might find themselves hearing confessions from fellow customers, creating a complex web of shared guilt and mutual absolution. The line between sin and necessity, between moral failure and survival strategy, was often too blurred to distinguish clearly. The legal system provided another form of reckoning, though one that was often delayed and unpredictable. Crimes committed in the heat of the moment might not be prosecuted for weeks or months, if at all. Witnesses might disappear, evidence might be destroyed, and the political climate might change in ways that affected the likelihood of prosecution. Justice, when it came, might bear little resemblance to what modern observers would consider fair or appropriate. The economic reckoning was perhaps the most immediate and tangible. Debts incurred during a night of gambling or drinking had to be paid, often with interest and penalties that could quickly spiral out of control. Property lost and wagers had to be surrendered, sometimes including items that were essential for the loser's livelihood. Families might find themselves impoverished by a single night's poor decisions, while others might discover unexpected windfalls that could change their circumstances dramatically. The social reckoning was more subtle but equally important. Reputations built over years could be destroyed in a single evening, while others might be enhanced by displays of courage, generosity, or skill. Marriage prospects might be improved or ruined based on behavior in the tavern, and business relationships might be strengthened or severed based on perceived loyalty or betrayal. The psychological reckoning was perhaps the most complex of all. The medieval mind was not equipped with modern concepts of trauma, addiction, or mental health, but the effects of tavern life on the human psyche were nonetheless real and significant. The constant exposure to violence, the pressure to maintain social standing through displays of aggression or recklessness, and the use of alcohol and other substances to cope with the harsh realities of medieval life, all took their toll on mental and emotional well-being. For some, the tavern represented a form of escape from the grinding poverty, social oppression, and limited opportunities that characterized medieval life for the majority of the population. It offered a space where normal social rules were suspended, where a peasant might drink with a nobleman, where a woman might exercise power and influence, where luck and skill could triumph over birth and breeding. But this escape came at a cost that many were unable or unwilling to pay. The cycle of tavern life was relentless and self-perpetuating. Each night brought new customers seeking the same things that had drawn their predecessors: food, drink, companionship, excitement, and the possibility of changing their circumstances through luck or skill. Each morning brought the same reckonings, the same attempts to make sense of what had happened and to prepare for what was to come. The tavern keeper who survived and prospered was one who understood this cycle and learned to work with it rather than against it. He provided what his customers needed while protecting himself from the worst consequences of their actions. He maintained order without stifling the energy that made his establishment profitable. He balanced the competing demands of law enforcement, religious authorities, guild regulations, and customer expectations while somehow managing to turn a profit. But even the most successful tavern keeper lived with the knowledge that his prosperity was built on a foundation of human weakness and desperation. The profits that allowed him to live comfortably came from the losses of others: the gamblers who couldn't stop playing, the drinkers who couldn't stop drinking, the lonely souls who paid for companionship they couldn't find elsewhere. This knowledge might trouble his conscience, or it might simply be accepted as the natural order of things in a world where survival often required moral compromise. The broader society that surrounded and sustained tavern culture was equally complicit in its contradictions. The same authorities who condemned taverns as dens of iniquity also relied on them for tax revenue, information gathering, and social control. The same church that preached against the sins associated with tavern life also benefited from the donations of tavern keepers and the confessions of tavern patrons. The same communities that ostracized tavern workers also depended on the services they provided. This hypocrisy was not lost on those who lived and worked in the tavern world. They understood that they were serving essential social functions while being condemned for doing so. They provided outlets for human needs and desires that had no other acceptable expression in medieval society. They created spaces where social tensions could be released before they exploded into more destructive forms. They offered opportunities for social mobility and economic advancement that were unavailable through legitimate channels. The legacy of medieval tavern culture extended far beyond the medieval period itself. The institutions, practices, and social relationships that developed in these establishments influenced the development of modern hospitality industries, entertainment venues, and social spaces. The tensions between regulation and freedom, morality and necessity, order and chaos that characterized medieval taverns continue to shape debates about social policy and individual liberty today. But perhaps the most important legacy of medieval tavern culture is the reminder it provides about the complexity and contradictions of human nature. The same people who were capable of great cruelty and selfishness in the tavern environment were also capable of great kindness and generosity. The same institutions that facilitated crime and vice also provided community and support for those who had nowhere else to turn. The same social dynamics that created conflict and violence also created bonds of loyalty and friendship that could last a lifetime. The medieval tavern was a mirror that reflected both the best and worst aspects of human society. It was a place where the veneer of civilization was stripped away to reveal the raw humanity beneath, with all its beauty and ugliness, its nobility and baseness, its capacity for both creation and destruction. In studying these institutions, we learn not just about medieval history, but about ourselves and the eternal human struggle to balance individual desires with social needs, personal freedom with collective responsibility, and the pursuit of happiness with the demands of survival. As the sun set on the medieval world and rose on the modern age, the taverns that had served as crucibles of human experience gradually evolved into new forms. But the fundamental human needs they had served for food, drink, companionship, excitement, and the possibility of transformation remained unchanged. The settings might be different, the technologies more advanced, the social structures more complex, but the basic dynamics of human interaction in spaces dedicated to pleasure and profit continued to play out in ways that would have been familiar to any medieval tavern keeper. The filthy truth about medieval taverns was that they were simultaneously the best and worst of their world, places of genuine community and brutal exploitation, of authentic human connection and calculated manipulation, of liberation from social constraints and enslavement to human weakness. They were institutions that revealed the full spectrum of human possibility, from the sublime to the ridiculous, from the heroic to the criminal, from the sacred to the profane. In the end, the medieval tavern stands as a testament to the resilience and adaptability of human society. Despite all the dangers, contradictions, and moral compromises involved, these institutions survived and thrived because they met real human needs in ways that no other social institution could match. They provided spaces where people could be fully human, with all the machines, complexity, and contradiction that entails. And in doing so, they created a legacy that continues to influence how we think about community, hospitality, and the eternal human search for meaning and connection in an often hostile and unpredictable world. The tavern door swings shut one final time. The fire burns down to embers, and the last customer stumbles out into the dawn. But the stories continue passed down through generations, reminding us that in every age, in every society, there are places where the human drama plays out in all its raw intensity. The medieval tavern may be gone, but its spirit lives on wherever people gather to share food, drink, stories, and the fundamental human experience of being alive in a world that is both beautiful and terrible, promising and threatening, full of both hope and despair. And perhaps that is the ultimate truth about medieval taverns. Not that they were simply dens of iniquity or centers of community, but that they were profoundly human institutions that reflected the full complexity of the human condition. They were places where people came to be themselves, for better or worse. And in doing so, they created a legacy that continues to resonate with anyone who has ever sought refuge from the world in the company of strangers, who might for a brief moment become friends.